What would you do if the moment you were meant to die became the moment everyone realized they had never truly understood you? This was the question that rose with the first pale line of dawn, right as the Renegade Princess stepped forward in chains and did something so calculated, so impossible, that even the executioners froze mid-breath. For years, her enemies believed she was a defeated heir, a discarded daughter, whose only legacy would be a silent death at sunrise. But the truth waiting behind her final act began long before that morning, woven through secret loyalties, forbidden knowledge, and a type of discipline no royal tutor could have taught her. The air was cold enough to bite, and the courtyard stones still held the darkness of the night. Soldiers lined the perimeter, their armor dull from hours of waiting. They expected fear. They expected trembling hands. What they saw instead was a woman studying the horizon as if dawn itself were her co-conspirator. Something in her gaze unsettled even the most seasoned guard, a quiet intensity born from nights without sleep and years spent out thinking men who underestimated her. When the chains were tightened, she didn't resist. She tilted her head as if listening to something beyond human hearing, and for a moment, the executioners felt as if she were the one measuring them, not the other way around. Several later admitted they felt an instinct to step back, as though standing too close to her at sunrise meant being drawn into whatever came next. And then, right as the first shaft of light touched the courtyard wall, she made her move. No scream, no plea, no sign of surrender. She took one deliberate breath and spoke a phrase none of them recognized, a phrase so old it felt like the cracking of buried stone. Soldiers glanced at each other, unsure whether they were witnessing treason, ritual, or prophecy. And when her voice cut through the morning air, the executioner's composure shattered. One man dropped, his blade. Another said his hands went numb. They didn't understand it then, but this was the moment everything shifted. Her final act was not a reaction to death. It was the trigger for something larger, a mechanism set in motion long before sunrise. If you have ever wondered how a single choice can unravel the certainty of powerful men, you already sense why this dawn mattered. You already feel the tension that held the courtyard captive, the creeping realization that the condemned princess was the only person there who knew the true script of that morning. And before we continue deeper into what she unleashed, I want to know what you felt reading this moment, because understanding your reaction is part of understanding her. Leave a comment telling me what struck you most so far, and make sure to like this video and check if you are subscribed, because what comes next will only get darker and more revealing as we move forward into the heart of her hidden plan. What the executioners did not know was that the phrase she whispered at dawn was not meant for them, nor for the crowd watching in tense silence. It was meant for someone who had already positioned themselves in the shadows long before her capture. The Renegade Princess had spent her final night in the cell not in despair, but in deliberate preparation, reconstructing the intricate path that had led her to this moment. Every humiliation, every interrogation, every calculated silence she offered her enemies had been part of a pattern only she fully understood. At dawn, that pattern finally revealed its purpose. She had predicted their schedule, the way soldiers rotated during the night watch, when the guards would be most exhausted, and exactly when the executioner assigned to tighten her restraints would hesitate just enough for her to observe the horizon without interruption. She knew dawn executions followed a rigid sequence, born from ancient tradition, one that demanded precision from the condemned as much as from the executioners. And by aligning her final act with the first strike of sunlight, she entered a symbolic space where fear, ritual, and authority collided. The phrase she spoke carried weight not because of its sound, but because of the timing. The guards didn't understand why their hearts jolted when they heard it, why a chill rippled through their spines even though the sun had just begun to warm the courtyard. They felt instinctively that the princess had activated something older than law, older than dynasties, something they had no training to confront. That sensation grew stronger as they remembered incidents from the night before, small details they dismissed at the time. The way she paused before answering questions, the way she seemed to observe the torchlight as though calculating the rhythm of its flicker, the way she asked for a moment of silence not to pray, but as if listening for footsteps no one else could detect. Rumors had followed her for years, whispered by deserters and wandering soldiers who claimed she possessed a memory so sharp it bordered on the unnatural. They said she could recall entire battlefields from a single glance, predict strategic maneuvers by studying the posture of a commander, or dismantle a negotiation simply by observing which hand a diplomat rested on the table. Whether these stories were truth or embellishment, they shaped the expectations of those who condemned her. They believed they were executing a cunning traitor. What they failed to realize was that her defiance came not from rebellion alone, but from a devotion to a logic they had never learned to decipher. As dawn advanced, the courtyard seemed to contract around her. The light spread in a slow, deliberate sweep, revealing tension in the faces of the guards and exposing cracks in their resolve. The princess noticed every detail: the trembling hand of a young soldier gripping his spear, the clenched jaw of an officer who had once served her father, the subtle shifting of boots across the cold stone as fear began to displace discipline. What none of them understood was that she had chosen this hour not for symbolism alone, but because dawn created a unique vulnerability among those tasked with ending her life. Their bodies were awake, but their instincts were still partially trapped in the fog of morning, suspended between duty and doubt. The phrase she uttered was merely the first step, a signal connected to a chain of events set in motion long before her arrest. It was not magic, nor prophecy, but a psychological strategy designed to fracture the certainty of her captors. And as the confusion spread through the ranks, the princess felt the shift she had been waiting for, a subtle but undeniable change in the energy of the courtyard. The hesitation she needed had finally begun to take hold, opening the way for the next move in her carefully constructed plan. The hesitation spreading through the courtyard did not emerge from a single moment of doubt. It came from the collision of every unspoken question the soldiers had carried since the princess was captured. Many of the men surrounding her had grown up hearing stories of her childhood, tales of a girl who survived political purges, shifting allegiances, and a court so venomous that trust was considered a liability. She had been shaped by environments designed to break even the strongest heirs, yet she learned to turn cruelty into calculation. What the guards saw as arrogance was, in truth, the sharpened instinct of someone who had been studying predators her entire life. The phrase she spoke at dawn echoed in their minds, not because they understood its meaning, but because they sensed deliberate intent behind every syllable. Humans fear what they cannot interpret, and the executioners felt as though they had been thrust into a story they did not know the ending to. Their training prepared them for resistance, for pleading, even for curses. But nothing prepared them for a condemned woman who treated the moment of her death as if she were conducting a final lesson. There was a confidence in her posture that unsettled them. Not defiance, not arrogance, but clarity. It was this clarity that had carried her through the years leading to her capture. Long before the morning of her execution, she had been forced to reinvent herself within the suffocating corridors of the palace. She learned to observe the slightest shift in tone, the weight of footsteps outside her chamber, the silent language of political alliances formed over shared glances at council meetings. When her family began to turn on itself, she adapted. When rival houses attempted to manipulate her future, she countered them with strategies they never discovered were hers. Betrayal was not a possibility in her world. It was the natural state of power. Those early years forged within her a particular kind of resolve, one the executioners could not comprehend as they watched her stand in the expanding glow of dawn. They expected fear, Yet she carried herself with the posture of someone who had already processed every path before her. She understood that the rituals of execution were not merely methods of punishment. They were theatrical tools meant to reinforce control. By disrupting even one element of that theater, she destabilized the entire structure supporting it. The youngest guard felt this instability first. He kept glancing at the princess as if afraid to blink, convinced that if he looked away, something irreversible would happen. He recognized her from a distance, not from personal experience, but from stories his mother used to whisper. Stories of a princess who deciphered battle plans faster than generals, who memorized enemy dialects after hearing them once, who navigated diplomatic feasts by reading the direction of candle smoke to predict political shifts. Whether these tales were exaggerations no longer mattered. In this moment, as she stood unmoving in her chains, they felt undeniably true. Others sensed shifts, too. A captain who had once escorted her father to war recognized the same focused stillness the king carried before launching a surprise attack. A veteran soldier recalled how traitors spoke before death, either pleading or raging, and how her calmness resembled neither. Instead, she seemed to be synchronizing herself with the rising sun, as though the light itself were part of her strategy. None of them could articulate it, but at that moment, they realized that they were not witnessing resignation. They were witnessing alignment. The princess had chosen dawn not as a symbolic hour, but as a tactical one. Light clarifies, exposes, disrupts shadows. And in that first thin beam crossing the courtyard, she found exactly what she needed, the moment when the human mind is awake, yet still fragile, impressionable, and prone to doubt. As that doubt deepened, her plan shifted into its next phase, unfolding quietly beneath the surface, anchored in memories and alliances her captors believed long dead. The ritual of execution was supposed to be simple, predictable and rigid, a sequence preserved through generations to prevent chaos or hesitation. But the moment the renegade princess disrupted even a single breath of that choreography, the ritual itself began to fracture. At first, the change was barely noticeable. A single guard shifting. His weight, an officer narrowing his eyes as though trying to reconcile what he saw with what he was trained to expect. But rituals survive on repetition, and once the pattern breaks, the mind instinctively begins searching for meaning where none should exist. The officers nearest her exchanged glances, each waiting for the other to reassert control. The princess noticed this instantly. Her childhood had taught her to identify the exact moment when a powerful man begins doubting the sound of his own authority. She recognized it in the subtle tightening of a jaw, the twitch of a gloved hand, the slight backward lean of a soldier who suddenly wished he were standing behind someone taller. These micro-expressions were the cracks she needed. She had once written secretly in her journals that control is not seized in grand gestures, but in the quiet space between two heartbeats when fear whispers louder than command. And now, as the sun thickened across the courtyard, she watched that truth manifest around her. One executioner stepped forward, lifted his blade, and hesitated. Not because he feared her strength, but because he feared the possibility that he misunderstood the moment. A sunrise execution demanded certainty. Yet certainty had fled the scene the moment she spoke that ancient phrase. What if he were striking at the wrong instant? What if she had manipulated the ritual in ways he did not understand? The weight of his hesitation rippled through the others like a tremor. She did nothing dramatic to break their composure. Instead, she turned her head slightly toward the rising light, allowing it to illuminate her face just enough for the soldiers to see the outline of a faint smile. Not arrogance, not defiance. Something far more dangerous. Intention. That expression unsettled them more than any scream or plea could have. People expect the condemned to resist or collapse. They do not expect them to appear as though they are waiting for someone else to make the next move. And in that stillness, the ritual collapsed. One guard took an involuntary step backward. Another muttered a prayer under his breath. A commander barked an order, but even he sounded unsure, his voice cracking in a way no one had heard before. The dynamic shifted so suddenly that several soldiers later described the moment as if the princess had reached inside their thoughts and rearranged them. In truth, she had done nothing of the sort. She simply understood human psychology better than the men assigned to kill her. She had learned as a child that if you interrupt the rhythm of power, you interrupt the confidence of those who wield it. And once confidence falters, obedience becomes fragile. The dawn execution had been designed to break her spirit publicly. Yet now it was the officers whose resolve was crumbling, one uncertain breath at a time. Her stillness became a mirror, forcing each man to confront his doubts, his fears, his memories of rumors that perhaps she was not merely a rebel princess, but a strategist capable of turning death into advantage. Even as her chains tightened, the courtyard felt lighter somehow, as if she were the only one grounded in purpose while everyone else floated in confusion. And that imbalance, subtle yet widening by the second, would open the door to the next stage of her plan, the stage her enemies never imagined she had prepared. Tell me in the comments what part of this shift in power struck you the most so far, because understanding how you perceive this moment helps shape the way we continue unraveling the truth behind her dawn uprising. What the soldiers could not begin to grasp was that the princess's act at dawn was not an isolated moment of defiance. It was the visible tip of a hidden structure she had been assembling for years, built from fragments of intelligence, overheard conversations, intercepted messages, and patterns she reconstructed long after others forgot them. Her quiet, unremarkable gestures had masked a mind that navigated complexity the way others navigated open roads. And the secret she carried into the execution courtyard was not a confession or plea for mercy. It was a military truth, capable of tilting entire borders. Long before her arrest, she had discovered discrepancies within the royal war ledgers, tiny inconsistencies that revealed something far more dangerous than corruption. A network of covert operations had been carried out without the king's knowledge, orchestrated by men who intended to reshape the balance of power behind the throne. Those operations relied on secrecy so absolute that even a rumor could collapse the entire scheme. And she had memorized every detail. Her enemies believed they had silenced her by chaining her wrists. They did not realize she was the last living person who could expose their hidden war. It was this knowledge that turned the dawn execution into a battleground. As the sun rose, her captors' unease grew, not because of superstition, but because each officer present had, in some way, participated in or benefited from the concealed campaign. They feared she knew too much. They feared what she might confess. And they feared even more what she might already have set in motion. Her silence became threatening precisely because they could not predict the moment she would break it. Standing in the courtyard, she watched these tensions surface like cracks beneath thin ice. The commander closest to her kept shifting his gaze between his men, attempting to maintain control. Yet every soldier who hesitated reminded him of the conspiracies he wished to bury. He feared that executing her in public might force a confession, and confessions carried echoes that did not die quickly. Once spoken, dangerous truths spread like fire through the kingdom. She understood this perfectly. She understood that fear of exposure was a stronger weapon than any blade. The phrase she spoke at dawn was not magic, nor ritual. It was a reference, a single coded acknowledgement tied to a military operation that the officers believed lost to time. Its meaning struck them at a level deeper than comprehension. It triggered the instinctual panic of men who realize their secrets are no longer secure. Several guards paled as the memory surfaced, not clearly, but enough to plant the suspicion that she might know every hidden maneuver they had once sworn to protect. The idea that she could expose them even in death twisted their composure into something brittle and unpredictable. Through the haze of uncertainty, the princess noticed a tremor of recognition in one officer's eyes. He had been present at a covert raid years before, one that had ended in disaster and been covered by a fabricated account. She wondered how long he had dreaded this morning, how many nights he had lain awake imagining that she had pieced together the truth. And now, as the courtyard brightened, she sensed him unraveling. When he tightened his grip on his sword, it was not courage that guided him, but fear of what she might reveal with her final breath. This fear was the real weapon she wielded. Her knowledge of their secret military failures, their unlawful campaigns, their fabricated victories. These were the pressures she applied without raising her voice or lifting her hands. She allowed the dawn light to do the rest, exposing the tension in their faces, the sweat on their palms, the cracks in their unity. If a single detail slipped, if even one officer reacted too strongly, the entire truth risked spilling open. And that possibility alone was enough to make them falter as she prepared for the next turn in her hidden strategy. The tension in the courtyard deepened as the morning light expanded, revealing the full extent of the unraveling that had begun the moment the princess spoke. What once felt like an orderly execution now resembled a fault line stretching beneath the boots of every man present. The officers kept exchanging terse glances, each silently urging another to act, to reassert control, to restore the rhythm the ritual had always relied upon. Yet no one stepped forward. The Renegade Princess had shifted the axis of the moment, quietly but irreversibly, and now the courtyard echoed with the kind of stillness that precedes collapse. She watched them with an expression that did not quite resemble confidence, nor defiance, but something far more composed: recognition. She saw the fear blooming behind their eyes, not the fear of her physical presence, but the fear of what she knew and what she might have already set in motion beyond this courtyard. She had learned long ago that information was a weapon far more enduring than steel, and she wielded it now with surgical precision simply by choosing silence where they expected desperation. Every second that passed without her explanation felt to them like another step into the unknown. One of the younger officers finally broke the pattern and took a step forward. His jaw tightened, his fingers twitched at the hilt of his sword, but even he could not hide the flicker of doubt that crossed his expression. The princess tracked it immediately. She knew that doubt. She had seen it before. Years earlier, during a failed campaign in the northern mountains, where soldiers confronted a truth their commanders had hidden from them, that same hesitation now returned, as if resurfacing from some buried part of their collective memory. The officers sensed something was wrong, but they could not articulate it. That uncertainty hollowed out the foundation of their discipline. The sun continued its ascent, casting long, thin rays across the ground. The princess used the shifting light to study the men around her, observing not their strength, but their fractures. She noted who avoided her gaze, who whispered to the man beside him, who tightened their stance as if to anchor themselves in the rising panic. She had spent her entire life reading people, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. The royal court had been a battlefield long before she ever stepped onto a true one, and survival required mastering the art of anticipating betrayal. Now, on the morning of her execution, those same skills resurfaced with razor sharpness. From the corner of her eye, she saw a captain she recognized from her childhood. He had once sworn loyalty to her father, yet here he stood among the men prepared to end her life. His gaze betrayed a struggle, a loyalty fractured by politics, by ambition, by the quiet pressure of men who needed the princess silenced before she could expose the truth. He looked at her for one brief moment, and in that split second, she saw it. The flicker of regret. Not enough to stop the execution, but enough to weaken his resolve. the regret of a man who feared history would not judge him kindly when the truth emerged. And beneath all of this tension lay a deeper, unspoken fear, one that none of the officers dared to voice, the fear that she was not acting alone. The princess knew they suspected it. Their eyes darted to the surrounding rooftops, to the shadows behind the columns, to the distant ridge beyond the walls. They feared an ambush. They feared coded signals. They feared that whatever she had unleashed with her dawn phrase was already in motion beyond their reach. Whether or not any of that was true did not matter. Fear made it real. The courtyard, once a symbol of the order, now felt like a vessel waiting to crack under pressure. The princess inhaled the cool morning air slowly, knowing that the next phase of her plan depended on the growing instability around her. She did not need to escape them physically. She needed only for their unity to fracture. And as the sun climbed another inch, she saw the first real break forming in their ranks, the sign she had been waiting for. The break in their unity began subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a hairline crack-in, a shield that had withstood years of war. The princess saw it the instant it formed. An officer to her left shifted his stance not out of discipline but out of uncertainty. Another guard adjusted his grip on his spear, though nothing had changed around him. These were not the movements of trained soldiers. These were the instinctive reactions of men who sensed a threat they could not define. And in the delicate space between instinct and understanding, fear began to bloom. The princess had always known that fear was not loud. It crept in quietly, like frost along the edge of a blade. It hardened slowly, gripping the mind before the body had time to resist. That morning, as the sun rose higher and painted the courtyard in sharper light, she watched that frost spread. It clung to the expressions of the guards, crystallized in the tightness of their shoulders, and lingered in the hesitation of their breath. Each man seemed to be waiting for someone else to move first, as though any action taken without absolute certainty might trigger consequences they could not predict. This was the precise psychological environment she had needed. Years earlier, she had written in her private notes that the most powerful element in any confrontation was not force, but imbalance. If you could disrupt a man's belief in the structure around him, you could dismantle his loyalty without ever lifting a weapon. Now, surrounded by her executioners, she felt the truth of those words unfolding in real time. The ritual meant to control her was now being undone by their own doubts. One guard, older than the others, kept his eyes fixed on her as though searching for an explanation. He had served in campaigns where she had negotiated truces that saved hundreds of men. He had seen her once, years ago, stepping between two rival generals without hesitation. There was something in her expression now, a stillness, a clarity, that reminded him of that day. A memory from before she became the kingdom's enemy. His gaze wavered, and in that moment of recognition, the princess sensed the crack widening. Another guard muttered something under his breath. A warning? A prayer? No one could tell. But the sound alone was enough to disrupt the fragile rhythm of the courtyard. A command was barked, louder than necessary, more desperate than authoritative. The officer who shouted it was not in control. His voice betrayed what he tried to hide, rising panic. The princess did not react. Outwardly, but inside she marked the moment carefully. Panic spreads faster than truth, and it infects the strongest first because they have more to lose. The executioners tried to restore order. They repositioned themselves, tightened their grips, and reminded each other of their roles. But the damage was done. The princess could see it in their eyes, the realization that something about this morning did not fit within the boundaries of their training. She had not fought. She had not pleaded. She had not cursed them. And that unnatural calm made them question everything they believed about her, about this execution, and about the power dynamics they thought they understood. Years of political betrayal had taught her that the moment a man doubts the justification for his violence, his strength becomes hollow. Now, as the courtyard trembled under the weight of unspoken fear, she understood that the advantage had shifted entirely. The executioners were no longer her captors. They were fragile men standing inside a ritual that had already lost its meaning. The sun edged higher, casting long, sharp shadows across the stone floor. The princess allowed the silence to stretch, knowing it was her strongest weapon now. She did not need to speak. She did not need to move. She needed only to let them feel the weight of their own unraveling, until the next stage of her strategy could emerge from the cracks forming around them. Tell me in the comments what emotion this unraveling of power made you feel, because your perception of this shift helps illuminate how deeply this moment reshaped everything that followed. The courtyard had become a living organism reacting to a force it could not identify. Every shifting shadow, every uneven breath, every uncertain glance rippled outward like tremors beneath the earth. The soldiers felt it first, a tightening in the chest, a creeping sensation that the morning no longer belonged to them. The officers felt it next, the prickle of awareness that no command they issued carried the weight it once did. And then, almost imperceptibly, even the onlookers sensed the change. Something in the air no longer aligned with the clean, predictable brutality of an execution. Instead, the scene felt suspended, as if some unseen threshold had been crossed. The Renegade Princess studied every detail. She saw the way a soldier near the gate nervously touched the hilt of his weapon, not out of readiness, but for reassurance. She saw the way. An officer's eyes darted toward the walls, searching for some explanation that would make sense of the uneasy silence. She saw the way the youngest guard swallowed hard, as if trying to keep fear from rising into his throat. These reactions were more telling than confessions. They reflected the moment a group of men accustomed to discipline became vulnerable to disruption. She had predicted this shift long before her capture. She had studied battlefield psychology, not from books, but from observation. During her years at the front, she watched seasoned warriors falter not when outnumbered, but when faced with uncertainty. She saw fear dismantle entire regiments after a single unexpected maneuver. She saw armies crumble because one soldier hesitated at the wrong moment. And now, standing in chains with dawn spreading behind her, she relied on that same principle. Not force, not rebellion, but controlled unpredictability. The officers attempted to regain authority, issuing commands sharper than the blades at their sides. Yet their voices lacked conviction. They barked orders with the speed of desperation, attempting to reassemble the ritual that had already fallen apart. The princess heard the tremor beneath each word. Power asserted without confidence is nothing more than noise, and the men around her were beginning to hear their own uncertainty echo back at them. One officer stepped forward to re-establish structure. His posture was rigid, his expression stern, but the princess recognized him. Years earlier, she had exposed a flaw in his strategy during a northern campaign, a miscalculation he had dismissed until it cost dozens of men their lives. She remembered the shame that crossed his face when her prediction came true. Now, as he approached her, she saw that same shame resurfacing. In his mind, she was no longer a prisoner. She was the one who had seen through him before, and might do so again. The soldiers sensed his hesitation. Doubt spreads, quickly in tightly wound groups, and once an officer falters, the entire formation absorbs the tremor. The princess felt the shift physically, as though the air around her loosened. The courtyard no longer resembled a place of execution. It resembled a battlefield seconds before an unexpected turn. What none of the men realized was that the princess had designed this tension intentionally. The dawn timing was not symbolic, it was tactical. The men were exhausted, their senses still adjusting to light, their bodies balancing between instinct and routine. In that fragile state, each detail became amplified. The scrape of metal, the rustle of fabric, the distant call of a morning bird. These tiny sounds, insignificant on any other day, now fed into the growing unease that something was unfolding beyond their comprehension. The princess breathed slowly, aware that every movement she made influenced the psychological balance around her. She did not need to fight. She needed only to guide. The unraveling. And as she watched the officers struggle to mask their fear, she felt the moment inch closer, the moment when everything they believed stable would slip from their grasp, and the next phase of her dawn strategy would ignite in full. The tension in the courtyard no longer felt like a silent unease. It had evolved into something heavier, something the soldiers could feel on their skin like pressure before a storm. The princess sensed it too, not with fear, but with the calm precision of someone who had spent her life reading invisible currents long before they broke into open chaos. She knew that when men faced uncertainty without guidance, they reached instinctively for anything that resembled meaning. That instinct, she realized, was now pulling them toward her whether they admitted it or not. Across the courtyard, an older priest stepped closer to observe the scene. His presence had not been expected. Executions rarely required spiritual oversight beyond ritual, recitation. Yet the moment the princess spoke her dawn phrase, he felt compelled to understand what had shifted. He studied her with the wary fascination of a man who recognized patterns in symbols, omens, and moments. The way the sunlight hit her chains, the silence that followed her words, the trembling uncertainty of the guards. These elements formed a tableau that felt eerily familiar. Something ancient, perhaps forgotten, seemed to echo beneath the surface. The officers noticed his concern. They exchanged uneasy glances, their discipline fraying further. The princess watched them carefully. She had always understood the power of symbolism, not as superstition, but as psychology. People feared what they could not categorize, and her captors could not decide whether she was a rebel, a martyr, or a prophecy unfolding before them. Their inability to choose made them vulnerable. As the priest murmured to himself, the youngest guard stepped back from the princess, as though she radiated a force he could not withstand. His foot scraped against the stone floor, the sound sharp enough to break what little composure remained. Several soldiers snapped their heads toward him, startled by even this small disruption. The princess didn't move, but her silence grew louder in their minds. Silence, after all, is rarely empty. It amplifies every fear a man carries. The air seemed to thicken as memories surfaced within the ranks. Many of the soldiers had grown up hearing variations of the same tale, that certain royal bloodlines carried a connection to omens, to unnatural insight, to shadows that moved through history in ways ordinary men could not trace. Most dismissed those stories as embellishments meant to elevate noble families. But now, staring at the princess as dawn carved its slow path across her features, those stories felt less like exaggerations and more like warnings. The priest's gaze sharpened. He recognized the phrase she had spoken. Not fully, not confidently, but enough for a fragment of memory to rise. A line from an old manuscript about executions halted by signs misinterpreted as divine. He could not remember the full passage, but he remembered the ending, the moment when hesitation became fate. And now, watching the officers freeze between action and uncertainty, he saw history threatening to repeat itself in the most dangerous way. The princess felt the shift inside them, like watching a structure tilt before collapsing. Their doubts were no longer isolated thoughts. They had become a shared pulse. Soldiers avoided each other's eyes. An officer's hand trembled near his weapon. The silence stretched until even the distant rhythm of horses outside the walls felt intrusive. The ritual had not simply broken, it had inverted, turning the executioners into the ones scrutinized, and the prisoner into the center of gravity. The princess lowered her gaze slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement of what she sensed unfolding. She had led them here without force, without commanding a single step. Everything was aligning exactly as she had predicted. Their beliefs, their fears, their fractured loyalties, all of it was converging upon the same point. And as the sunlight brightened, revealing every line of tension on their faces, she knew that the moment she had orchestrated from the beginning was nearly ready to take shape. The final shift came not with violence, nor with theatrics, but with a silence so complete that even the morning birds seemed to pause. The soldiers stood as if rooted to the stone floor, their weapons heavy in their hands, their breath shallow. The Renegade Princess could feel the moment ripen, that delicate edge where fear, doubt, and revelation converge into something irreversible. It was here, in this suspended breath of dawn, that her strategy reached its true purpose. For the first time since the ritual began, she lifted her eyes fully toward the executioners. Not sharply, not defiantly, but with the unblinking steadiness of someone who had already outlived the version of her they believed they were killing. The effect was immediate. Several men stepped back. One dropped his spear. Another whispered a fractured prayer under his breath. The priest looked as though he recognized something in her expression, something that made him grip the edge of his cloak as if he feared the implications of understanding. What they felt was not supernatural. It was the weight of truth. Because the princess did not merely carry secrets, she embodied the exposure of their own. She understood how deeply they feared the history they had buried, the operations they had concealed, the loyalties they had broken. And now, standing before them as though illuminated from within by the rising sun, she represented the one force they could not silence: consequence. Every man present sensed that killing her would not end the truth. It would ignite it. The commander attempted to restore order, but his voice cracked, betraying the fear he had tried to suppress. The princess watched him with calm curiosity. She knew that he, more than anyone, understood what would happen if her execution proceeded. His hand shook, not from pity, but from the knowledge that history would eventually trace every thread of corruption back to him and his fellow conspirators. The weight of legacy, so often spoken about with pride, now pressed upon him like a blade. A gust of wind swept through the courtyard, carrying dust and fragments of dry leaves. It felt like a signal, though no one could say from whom. The princess straightened subtly, her chains clinking softly, and the sound echoed with an almost ceremonial finality. The soldiers froze. The silence deepened. The entire execution, once a display of dominance, had become a stage collapsing under the gravity of its own deception. She knew then that she had already won, not by escaping, not by fighting, but by forcing them to confront the truth they had tried to bury under orders and rituals. In this fragile dawn, she had shifted from prisoner to catalyst, and nothing would return to the way it was before. Her breath steady, her voice low enough to blend with the morning air, she spoke a final line, not a threat, not a plea, but a reminder that the choices made in fear echo far longer than those made in courage. And as those words settled into the stillness, the men around her understood that whatever happened next would define them just as much as it would define her. If you stayed with this story until now, I would love to know what moment struck you the hardest. Leave a comment and write the phrase "I am still here" so I know you walked through every step of this dawn with her. And if this journey stirred something in you, consider subscribing to the channel so you do not miss the stories that unravel the hidden truths behind power, betrayal, and survival. A like on the video also helps keep these narratives alive, and there is a continuation waiting for you right beside this one. There is a video here that deepens everything we explored today. Click it and keep walking with me into the shadows of history.